Florida's new homeless bill will soon take effect, but the bill requires that homeless shelters will require the occupants not to use drugs. But when the vast majority of the people that are homeless in the state of Florida are homeless because of their addiction, it's questionable how effective this law will actually be. What will happen to Florida's homeless population with the new anti-homeless law that Governor Ron DeSantis signed? A place to start will be to look at what happened with SB 1718, Florida's anti-immigrant law. It seems like the state of Florida is going after anybody it deems undesirable. First it was the illegal immigrants, now it's the homeless, and there's no idea who could be next. But the state of Florida also does things just for face value. It seems like these immigration laws that were going to go after the immigrants changed absolutely nothing in the state of Florida. Sure, for a while a few people left, but now things have gone back to exactly how they were before. And it seems like these laws are more of a tactic to scare people or to gain political clout. But in reality, nothing really changes. Florida's anti-immigrant laws are a good indicator of how these homeless laws are going to change the state. For the most part, it's going to scare away some people, but eventually the state of Florida will go back to being exactly the way it was before. These laws are simply a tactic to make the people in Florida feel like their governor is doing something about illegals, doing something about homelessness. But realistically, if you look at that immigration law in Florida, it almost seems like nothing changed at all. And while before the law there was a lot of anger and frustration, after the law, it seems like things in Florida continue to be exactly the way they were before. And if I knew the state of Florida after living here nearly 30 years now, I would say it almost seems like probably nothing's going to change with the homeless population. These are just tactics to make people feel like something's being done, but in reality, things continue as normal. So I would say that the homeless population, perhaps many people will flee before the law takes effect. We saw with 1718 how ineffective the Florida state was to actually implement any noticeable changes throughout the state. There was a few law enforcement agencies like Lee County, for example, that did go after immigrant groups, but that was a failed attempt. The people that moved into those communities actually turned things worse. The physical implementation of Florida's anti-immigrant law took place in Fort Myers, Florida, in a place called Pine Manor. It turned the neighborhood from a bad neighborhood to an absolute zombieland apocalypse. See, with the immigrants that did leave the state of Florida, roughly about 300,000 people, if that, left behind a housing void. A housing void that was filled in with people from very bad economical backgrounds. Because most of these illegal immigrants were living in poor neighborhoods, this availability of affordable housing turned the neighborhoods into complete gangland warfare. If you guys remember my predictions about what would happen with the immigration law in Florida, I predicted that the neighborhoods that became vacant would become very dangerous high crime areas. We have seen how that prediction was very accurate. I also predicted that we would see large growth of gang violence in Florida, and this is exactly what's taken place since. To the point where now we're seeing entire gang busts of hundreds of people at once throughout the entire state of Florida. Polk County just did it. Jacksonville just did it. It seems like these neighborhoods that had illegal immigrants in them, when they left a void behind. That void was filled with society's most undesirable people, and it led to exactly what I told you guys it would, an influx of gangs. And now gangs are becoming a serious problem in Florida. SB 1718 was a complete failure of an act of law. It left behind a void that was filled with people that turned the neighborhoods into gangland zones. And now the state of Florida has more gangs than it ever has before. Since the implementation of this immigration law in combination with the new gun laws in the state of Florida, we have seen the state become a violent crap hole. Sarasota in 2023 had 0 homicides, but this year it's already up to 6. The last few laws that the state of Florida has implemented have turned the state into a violent, gang-infected crap hole. We've seen how these laws have actually made things worse versus than better. We saw how before the implementation of the anti-immigrant law, the homeless population was happy that finally these immigrants were going to leave the state of Florida because it would open up housing so they could live in. Well, the homeless people never took advantage of those housing opportunities. The collateral damage of this immigration law was so bad that the state of Florida went from incredible growth to stagnant health condition in the real estate market. Even the governor of Florida has recently admitted that it's over for Florida. The adverse effects of this immigration law show that there was very little thought and actual consulting done regarding this law and the effects that it would have upon the state. And it was more of let's just do something or say something to make the people happy, recklessly not considering the effects of the law. And it seems like with this new homeless law, we could see a lot of the things that happened with the immigration law be very similar. Namely, a law that initially at face value might scare some people away, but in the long term will have absolutely no benefit for the state of Florida. And perhaps the collateral damage from this law could be so severe that it makes a bad situation worse. Now, Florida's immigration law had the potential to reap benefits for the state. Unfortunately, those benefits were so limited and the damages were so high that even the little progress that the law made became insignificant. And at this point, it has been completely annulled by the fact that people illegally continue to enter the state of Florida. And well, it seems like nothing's really changed. So if you are homeless in the state of Florida, perhaps this homeless law could be very similar to the immigration law. A law that at first scares a lot of people. At first, a lot of people leave the state because of the law. But the long-term implementation of the law, real-life practice, means that perhaps this law will never actually hit the floor. Very few municipalities actually ran with the illegal immigration law, namely the area of Fort Myers, and we saw how horribly that worked out. But perhaps there's more hate for the homeless than there is for the immigrants on a county-by-county level. It could be that the homeless population is hated more than the illegal population, and that more counties and municipalities are actually willing to try to implement these laws in the state. After all, the homeless population is disproportionately making up a larger percentage of the arrests. In some counties, homeless make a huge percentage of the population that's arrested, while illegal immigrants seem to actually be more law-abiding than regular citizens. After all, if you get caught with a small charge, you could end up getting deported, so we know that most people that are here illegally want to fly under the radar. In reality, not too many counties in Florida outright want to go after the illegal population. In the state of Florida, it seems like only Lee County really went after the illegal population, and the collateral damage was so much that now, well, it turned the county into a complete crime crap hole, and the neighborhoods that used to have illegals that were hardworking families are now overrun with gangs and dealers. And it's important to talk a little bit about that immigration law because that immigration law is kind of the same exact thing as the homeless law. It's a law that goes after a group of undesirable people. But there's a difference between illegal immigrants and homelessness. Homelessness consists of people that are predominantly dealing with addiction, mental health problems, disabilities, and individuals who produce absolutely nothing for society. So you can't compare the economical impact of people who are hardworking and providing services like working for society versus people who are almost a detriment to society. Now, the state of Florida offers very little help, and it has been working outside of due process to oppress and persecute the homeless population, which has led to a marginalization of this community within the state that has put them so far outside the grasp of normality that if you become homeless in Florida, your chances of dying become, well, almost guaranteed. I recently did a video where we talked about if you become homeless in Florida, your chances of dying are infinitely great. It's a state that has been working outside of due process to oppress a group of people, and today now these individuals are actually getting some type of legislature where before the lack of legislature left law enforcement officers with very little legal tactics to try to deal with the problem. Now, there still remains an issue that laws that state things like sleeping in public are an arrestable offense. These types of laws seem borderline tyrannical, and it seems like the oppression of the state of Florida will now come to a culmination in that law enforcement officers can just simply arrest somebody for being homeless, despite the fact they have done nothing malignant other than their economical situation. Basically, you're getting arrested for being poor. Now, Florida's immigration law came side by side with new gun laws. These laws were implemented at the same time, and it's difficult to tell if some of the effects are from one law or from the other. Well, simultaneously, also, Florida will probably become a state of legalization, which will prevent police officers, one of the greatest tools that they have for interfering with pedestrians and people that are driving and being able to seize anything. Hey, it smells suspicious in your vehicle. Probable cause. This is how many of the weapons and, of course, illegal things that are caught in the state of Florida are caught under this basis. If it becomes legal in the state of Florida, perhaps it will no longer be a probable cause to search somebody, which means that law enforcement will have their hands tied in actually going after illegal activities. But if they have this wide open window for going after the homeless, legalization will pose some serious threats to the way the state of Florida runs. And again, it's another law that will give people a mask to continue to do things that are illegal and take away tools that law enforcement had to find things like weapons and other illegal substances. So we can be assured that with this implementation of the homeless law, probably adjacent with legalization in the state, we can see that law enforcement officers will have their hands tied in actually tracking down illegal substances. But they will have full reign to go after the homeless, since it doesn't seem like there's anything preventing them from arresting the homeless now. Now, the state of Florida, I have noticed a trajectory of many of these agencies, and it is the simple persecution and lack of due process and going after the homeless population viciously, aggressively, and mercilessly. And now with this law, you're giving them a tool to do it on an even larger scale. Many times when you look at a law, the intent of the law is far more of significance than the actual application of the law. And we could dive deeper into that, but time is limited. But we know in the case of the immigration law that the intent was to further discrimination against the Latino community in Florida. Many people felt that this law would even be used to harass Latinos that were legal in the state. However, none of that actually came into fulfillment because the intent of that law was nothing more than to garnish social media clout, to garnish news stories, to draw attention to the state of Florida. But in practice, nothing ever happened. It is possible that this homeless law in the state of Florida could be nothing more than another social media gimmick to draw attention to the state and make a statement about Florida more than actually resolving a problem. As always, counties and municipalities have the option to try to implement some of these changes in their counties, and some of these counties will do it. But will that shape the future of the entirety of the state of Florida? Are we actually going to see the entirety of the state of Florida become a no homeless zone? I highly doubt it. For one, the state of Florida refuses to actually acknowledge the real number of Florida's homeless population, somewhere between 90,000 to 110,000. The state continues fixed on their analytics of Florida Health of around 30,000 people, a number that simply doesn't add up. If you don't acknowledge the real number of Florida's homeless population, how could you ever provide enough resources to handle it? As it sits currently, there are neither enough homeless shelters nor prison cells in the state of Florida for the entirety of the homeless population. So again, this is another law that in actual implication seems impossible. It could also be a tactic by the state of Florida to, on paper, lower their homeless population and make it appear like these people exist even less than they do already. After my efforts on my YouTube channel to expose the real number of the homeless population in Manatee County where I live, they changed the number from 188 to something like 760. But the number that they added to Manatee County, they subtracted from other counties to keep the overall number at exactly the same. Basically, when I started to expose the real number of homeless people in Manatee County, they went in there and made it a more realistic figure. Now, this number of 188 for Manatee County showed clearly that if we could in one county show the real number of homelessness, impossible to do in every single county. But the state of Florida actually went in and adjusted the number for Manatee County because they knew that I was exposing the reality of this county, which goes to show that the only intent that Florida actually has, it doesn't seem like the state of Florida is worried about fixing the problem. They're worried about distorting the narrative to make it seem like the problem doesn't exist. And a law like this enables the state of Florida to, again, on paper, eliminate the problem from existence. Now, the state of Florida's law enforcement agencies know the actual number of transient and homeless people in the state of Florida, but they will not divulge that number. They know that the number in Florida Health is a far miscalculation. But basically, when the state of Florida is worried about distorting the actual physical evidence of numbers, when the state of Florida is worried about not giving these people due process, how can the people of Florida trust that a state that has a reputation of distorting information and working outside of due process, this has been how they've been handling the homeless population, that if there's new legislation about the homeless, that it isn't going to further their oppression and persecution? It is difficult for the public to believe that a state that has this reputation is actually now all of a sudden going to do the right thing and provide a place for the homeless people to sleep. That does not check out because their reputation. For the state of Florida to say that it's going to help the homeless people, it's like a homeless person telling you they're going to use that $20 bill to get food. No, we know what you're going to use that $20 bill for. And the same thing can be said about the state of Florida. We know what your real intentions are. You're not fooling anybody. The actual question here is the implementation. If it's left to a county by county level, some counties will take advantage of these opportunities to try to make some logical changes. As long as the state of Florida continues to have a lack of industry, as long as the state of Florida continues to have a massive addiction problem, so, the homeless situation in Florida isn't really a homeless situation. 95% of the people that are homeless on the streets are addicted. It's not a homeless problem. It's an addiction problem. The same thing can be said about mental health. It isn't a homeless problem. It's a mental health problem. The state of Florida refuses to help people have access to health care, refuses to provide any help to the people. After all, the state of Florida doesn't even have a state income tax, so the state doesn't offer anything to poor people. So a state that doesn't offer anything to people that are poor is inherently going to have a massive health crisis. In the state of Florida, that health crisis comes down to homelessness caused by addiction that's untreated. And of course, we know for a fact, mental health with no access to anything. Take the city of Bradenton, Florida. The city of Bradenton, Florida has a huge percentage of mentally ill people infirmed on the streets living out there, but it doesn't have more than a handful of mental health centers. The adjacent suburb of Lakewood Ranch has dozens of mental health places you can go to. What does that tell you? The people that have money have access to health care, but the people that are poor and desperately need it, these areas don't even have, if you were to pay for it yourself, it doesn't even exist. Take a look at the city of Bradenton. I think there's like 3 mental health places in the entirety of the city of Bradenton. While suburbs like Lakewood Ranch, these facilities are plentiful, but that's because people are paying for it. And that's really inherently that the state of Florida has. The state of Florida wants to position itself as a top-ranking state, but when it comes to health, it's impossible because there's no funding for it. And they'll never have funding because the type of state it is. If you look at all the other states in the South, they have the same problem. So if you don't start to address the underlying causes of homelessness, Predominantly, it revolves around how bad healthcare is in Florida, and many times this leads to the homeless population having staph infections, the homeless population getting amputations because of lack of basic care. The homeless people, their health situation is very delicate. Many of them are dying from infections, others are dying from overdoses. There just isn't any type of health care available to the homeless in the state of Florida. Many times I've ran into people that have a terminal condition and they're on the streets and they kind of self-medicate themselves to an overdose because after all, if you're homeless and you're on the streets and you're having a terminal condition, what other option do these people see? It just seems like it's almost a diabolical level of neglect. Again, what's causing Florida's homeless problem is addiction and lack of health care. All these causes of homelessness are not being addressed. So how can we expect the problem to go away when the causes remain wide open? When you start to act tyrannically, you start to garnish a lot of resentment from the population. And if you're going to start to just oppress the homeless population even more, eventually it's not so much the homeless population that you're going to have a problem with, but it's going to be the people that work in healthcare, the people that work in law enforcement eventually refuse to implement the laws. That's kind of what happened with the immigration law, by the way. Most police officers want to go after real criminals, but if you make them go after working class families and try to get people deported and try to turn your police officer into immigration agents, that doesn't really work. Those police officers want to go after real criminals. They want to actually feel like their job is fulfilling. But when you become a tyrannical place and start to oppress people and try to use law enforcement to oppress the society more than to protect it, it lowers the morale of the officers that are implementing these laws. Already, a lot of the homeless population is telling me that the police officers in their districts are not going to go after them. I've talked to a few police officers who are telling me they know the homeless population, they work with them all the time, they have to arrest them, and many times when law enforcement officers arrest the homeless population, they do it because they have to, not because they want to. These officers are most likely not going to go on this tyrannical oppression of the homeless because they feel that that's a demoralizing thing to do. Police officers understand that addiction and lack of healthcare are at the core of Florida's homeless problem because they're dealing with it on a daily basis. And these officers are not going to go on this tyrannical thing against the homeless. So it comes down to, on a local level, on an officer by officer level, are these police officers really going to start to harass the homeless population? If the city councils force them, they may have to do something. But a lot of individual homeless people that have been chronically homeless in the state of Florida, that have worked out some type of living arrangement where they respect law enforcement and they've set boundaries, and these homeless people seem to just stay out of the way, it's difficult to believe that law enforcement officers are going to become tyrannical against those individuals because, again, those individuals are kind of working, I don't know, they have some type of unspoken agreement. Now, it's just like the immigration law had some undesirable aspects, I think the homeless law also has the potential to backfire. One way that this homeless law could backfire, I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but most of the homeless camps and garbage and all the filth from the homeless is centered around commercial real estate properties. Now, law enforcement in a lot of these municipalities is able to come into these areas and extract the homeless. I don't know if you guys have noticed over the last few years how law enforcement seems to protect the interests of large corporations while not caring too much about residential problems. For example, if somebody comes and steals your bicycle and you have a video footage of the person that stole your bicycle, many times law enforcement will do nothing about it. But if you go into a Walmart and you steal from a Walmart, you best believe they're coming to get you. And one of the biggest misunderstandings about law enforcement, the police is not here to protect you. The police is here to protect the commercial interest of large corporations. If you as an individual are victimized, law enforcement does nothing. But if one of these large corporations becomes victimized, then the whole squad's out there. And it's sad to say it, but that's the reality of law enforcement in the year 2024. Now, a lot of people that are wealthy and affluent really haven't caught on to this, because the moment a crime is committed and they're the victims, law enforcement will arrest a random homeless person and have them take the charges. Or if there's somebody in the neighborhood or vicinity that they're trying to eliminate, they'll say it was this particular person. There's a resolution for criminal activities promptly when certain individuals are the victims. But for the most part, if you're a normal person today, law enforcement's not there to protect your interests. They're there to protect the interests of large corporations. You walk into a store and you see cameras and you're like, those cameras are there to protect me. No. Those cameras are there to protect the financial interests of those corporations. And I say all that to say that it looks like with these laws that are coming to the state of Florida with homelessness, we're going to grab a problem that is plaguing the commercial sector and we're going to dump it into residential areas. When the homeless are not able to be vagrant in commercial districts like they are now, they're going to be vagrant in residential areas. And already this is taking place in anticipation for the law, which makes me think that seriously the state of Florida has already made a huge mistake with this law. And well, we're going to see the actual effects here soon. As this law approaches, I'm starting to see homeless people already break into vacant buildings. If we're going to get arrested for sleeping on the outside of the building, we might as well break in and be on the inside of the building. Now, there's a lot of vacant commercial buildings, but a lot of the homeless are already forcing themselves into, that's right, residential communities. And the problem with that is that law enforcement is not as proficient as dealing with homeless people in residential areas, particularly impoverished residential areas, as they are as prolific of protecting the interests of big corporations. Basically, I don't know if you guys have realized it, but what's about to happen in the state of Florida is that you're going to grab a problem that's affecting big corporations in commercial lots, and you're going to dump it into residential areas. Boy, I hope I'm not right about this one, but I was right about the immigration law. If you remember my prediction for the immigration law, I told you guys that most likely we're going to see an increase in homicides in these areas. We did. We're going to see an increase in gangs. We did. All my predictions for the immigration law were fairly accurate, with the exception of, well, I overestimated the implications of the law. It seems like this law was all about face value, but I did mention that that was a possibility. Anyways, we'll have to see the actual implementation of this law, but it leaves a wide open window, or should I say broken window. It seems like if you're going to arrest the homeless people for sleeping on the sidewalks, then, well, they may as well sleep indoors. Already the state of Florida is having a problem with squatting, and, well, it seems like many of the homeless people have already decided they're going to squat. And I don't know if you guys know this, but there's a lot of vacant properties in Florida, especially residential properties, because a lot of people snowbird in the state of Florida. Those properties could soon deal with a massive homeless invasion. A lot of people tell me, well, I got my guns and anybody that comes on my property. Shut your mouth. You are not as dangerous as these homeless camps. Going into your property is not scarier than these people are living in the woods in Florida. They're being victimized. They're being do you realize how dangerous these homeless camps are? They're not afraid to come on your property. There's danger. It's actually safer probably to go on your property. You have no idea how dangerous these homeless camps are. These people are not afraid of going into your property. They're not afraid of you doing something to them if they trespass on your property. They're homeless. They're living in the woods. They're being victimized left and right. You're not going to scare these people. Sure, they know that there's a threat that something could happen, but do you really think they're scared? Probably not. We can anticipate news articles in the following weeks about homeless people going into places they're not supposed to and getting hurt, or altercations. And if you pull it, you better be ready to use it, because a lot of these homeless people are already from the gutter, so they're not going to sit there and be intimidated by you. If you pull it, you might be ready to use it. If you told it, you might as well boat it or something like that. I don't know what the old saying is. But at the end of the day, we're going to start to see a lot of residential confrontations. Mark my words, this is going to be headlines. And, the notion that people have that you can just flush your homeless problem on the neighboring states, that's not acceptable. You can't grab your problem and make it somebody else's. That's not how you become a better state. You become a better state by addressing the underlying issues that are causing the problem, not by casting your problems upon other people. That's not the type of state you want to be. You want to resolve the problem, because if you don't resolve the problem, tomorrow's homeless population is already being brewed in the state of Florida because you're not fixing the underlying issue. Now, if these counties and municipalities actually start to force these people into the programs they need to be in, the homeless could benefit greatly, because to be honest, a lot of times the homeless people are out there and you have to kind of force them to do what they need to do. And if you were to grab these people and put them in the centers they need, put them in the rehab centers, kind of force these people to have to change their lives, it could greatly benefit the homeless population. It comes down to the intent of the law and the implementation. If the intent really is to get these people off the streets and they actually do implement services for these people, if you actually got these people off the streets forcefully and into the programs they need, rehab centers, mental health facilities, you could do the homeless population a massive, massive good deed. The people that are on the streets homeless, they don't want the help. A lot of them are dealing with trauma, so they refuse the help even though they know they need it. If you grab these people that are out there addicted and homeless and dealing with mental health issues, and you simply grab them and force them into these rehab programs, it would do these people a massive, massive benefit. Because a lot of these people, believe it or not, could be reintegrated into society, but because they're not being forced to do it, they're not doing it. And I've already seen homeless people talk about getting off the streets or moving to another state where they have family because of the incoming law. So perhaps if the implementation of this law is done correctly and it forces these people off the street, a lot of times laziness comes into play. They don't want to do it, or they'd rather be on the streets. But if you grab these people, you give them no other option, you put them in the programs they need, you get them off the substances, perhaps they could go on to live very productive lives in the future and be able to be a more significant role for their families. And perhaps if the implementation of the law is done correctly and you force these people into programs, you force them to get the help they need, it would do the state of Florida a great service. And these homeless people, whether they accept it or not, they need the help. They need the intervention. Because many of the people I meet out here are like, well, yeah, I know I'm addicted. I know I'm dealing with this problem, but maybe one day I'll fix it. And that day never comes. So if you force them into those programs and get the help they need, it'll do them a great service. They need it. So perhaps I've already seen a lot of homeless people move to other states in anticipation of the law. I've already seen homeless people start to make changes in their day-to-day life in anticipation for the law. Perhaps if they actually implement this law the way it's intended to be, or the way they're saying they're intending, then it would be a great service to the homeless people, because a lot of these people do just need to be forced to do the right thing, and it will benefit them greatly. So again, if the law is implemented the way that they're telling us it's going to be implemented, where you're going to grab the homeless people and force them into the programs they need, it would do these homeless people a great and very necessary deed of getting them off the streets and forcing them to take the help that they desperately need. And if that were the way that this law gets implemented, it would be the best thing that's ever happened to Florida's homeless population. Because out on the streets, they're either going to die, they're going to get overdosed, they're going to get victimized, and they're eventually going to die a horrible, miserable death on the streets of Florida, because this place is literally uninhabitable for the homeless. But it remains to be seen whether these programs are actually going to help the homeless people, or if they're just trying to continue their oppression. It's very difficult for me to believe that the state of Florida is going to do something good for the homeless people when they're currently working outside of due process against them. Now, the other issue is how dangerous these homeless shelters are. Now, I've done videos showing you guys how dangerous these homeless shelters are, The videos didn't get a lot of views, and I wish it had got more views because people do need to see this. People do need to see how dangerous these homeless shelters are at night. These homeless shelters at night are dangerous. They're scary. They're bedbug infected. I've done a lot of work with the homeless, and a lot of the homeless people tell me go to the shelters at night and see what's going on. And it's shocking, really, to see what's going on in these homeless shelters. These homeless shelters at night are scary. There's fights. There's people extorting you. There's people robbing you. So, a lot of the homeless population, with reason, is afraid of these homeless shelters. And again, I have done videos that expose these homeless shelters at night. Constant fights, constant shootings, problems, stabbings, all of that. It's understandable that the homeless population doesn't want to end up in these homeless shelters because they're so dangerous and they're not free. They charge people $15 a night. The Salvation Army at least charges people. But like I've said, these homeless shelters are very dangerous, and I've seen it firsthand, and I can understand why the homeless people don't want to end up in these homeless shelters with reason. So the other problem that the state of Florida has is, well, you can't just grab 100 homeless people that have mental health problems, addiction, put them all in one place and expect them to get along. How dangerous. The state's talking about creating a place where the homeless can actually go to. How dangerous are those places going to be? And how much tolerance are law enforcement going to have towards addiction, paraphernalia? Because after all, the vast majority of Florida's homeless population is addicted. And, when you look at the writing on the wall, right, when you read this law and you see what it says, it denotes that these have to be drug-free facilities. Well, if 95% of Florida's homeless population is addicted, and you tell me that there are no drugs allowed or anything like that allowed in these places, what do you think is going to happen? Well, clearly the homeless population is not going to go to these shelters because they're addicted and there's no drugs allowed there. So that opens another window that a vast majority of the homeless population is going to refuse services. They're going to refuse going to these shelters, and they're going to continue living a life of lawlessness. They might have to find themselves going deeper into the woods. They might have to find themselves being more nocturnal. They may have to find new ways of surviving, which most likely are going to make them more dangerous, more seclusive, and of course, more untrackable than ever, and more propense to committing crimes for their day-to-day survival, because after all, homeless people are fairly stubborn. A lot of the homeless people that I meet and deal with, they are stubborn. A lot of them have conspiracy theories. A huge percentage of the homeless population have anti-government conspiracy theories, so they're not going to cooperate. The homeless population is a lawless population. They don't want to assimilate into government programs, so many of them may take the help and change, but too many of them, especially those that are chronically homeless, have developed a lot of conspiracy theories. They have a lot of ideologies with the way they live, and those types of people are simply not going to make good candidates for these programs. They're going to hide. They're going to continue to elude the law, and it's going to create a situation where, well, you're just further marginalizing these people. But again, these individuals are not going to conform to the law. You have some homeless people that want to be homeless. They become accustomed, just like people become institutionalized to the system. Some people become institutionalized to the streets. They're used to this lifestyle. They want to continue to live in these conditions because in these conditions they feel that they don't have any responsibilities. And again, misinformation has been plaguing these people. They're all dealing with all these crazy conspiracy theories and all these crazy ideologies that at the end of the day do nothing but help enable their own destruction, or at least excuse themselves. They feel that they're excused. They find a way to kind of excuse their behavior. They feel, well, the government's horrible, so if I'm doing these bad things over here, people always try to justify what they're doing wrongly, and they find ways to justify their behaviors. With the homeless population, you have a lot of people out there that they simply believe that this is the way they want to live, and to try to force those people to conform to a program or a homeless shelter, they're not going to do that. In their infancy of homelessness, they tried going to homeless shelters and they figured out that they were dangerous places, and they don't want to be in those situations. And they like the freedom of, camping out somewhere, even though it's highly dangerous, it's still safer than a homeless shelter. So the state of Florida may have to find ways to actually address safety at these homeless shelters, because even those who don't have those ideologies, don't have the conspiracy theories, just regular homeless people are afraid of these homeless shelters. And after doing videos there at night myself, I can confirm to you that if I was homeless, I would not want to end up in these places. They're far too dangerous, far too violent, far too scary. So you have individuals that are going to find ways to conform to the new laws by breaking into buildings, by, well, if now it's a felony to do this, it's also a felony to do that. You have individuals that are simply going to start breaking into properties. You have individuals that are going to start squatting in residential areas. You have individuals who, because of their ideologies and conspiracy theories, are never going to adapt to the system. These are individuals that are lawless. They're going to continue to be lawless. They're going to continue to be a detriment to society, and they're going to continue to inflict harm upon themselves by their homeless lifestyle. And then you have other individuals that would go to a homeless shelter, but they're simply afraid because of their past experiences. You have individuals who've been banned from homeless shelters. You have regulations at homeless shelters that they can't comply with. In other words, the law doesn't seem to offer a solution for everybody. It may be a solution for some, but it isn't a solution for everybody. So there's no way that one law that is this vague is simply going to eliminate homelessness for an entire state, especially a state that, again, is masking the real numbers. You have 100,000 people homeless on the streets of Florida. Each one of those persons has a unique situation. They have unique challenges that they are facing, and one single solution isn't going to fit everybody's problem. A lot of people out here need psychological service, particularly the females. And then on top of that, you add addiction. So here you have somebody with a mental disorder. On top of that, you have an addiction. They need good mental services. Is the state of Florida really going to provide good mental services to individuals that are weak, vulnerable? It's questionable. It's difficult for the state to provide that solution. And I know the state of Florida, and I highly doubt that they're actually going to invest enough money into these resources to get these people the help they need, because people who work can't afford these services, to be honest with you. So here you have a situation where they're promising a lot, but in reality, there are so many different circumstances out there. Homelessness will continue to exist in Florida. No law is ever going to eliminate homelessness. There are just too many variables with the circumstances that these people are facing. And there's individuals who are lawless. They are going to want to do everything they can to stay on the streets addicted. They're not going to try to reform themselves. And again, I'm not excusing their behavior. I'm explaining to you exactly what is going to happen with these individuals. The ones that have conspiracy theories, the ones that are disabled veterans and they feel like their government did them wrong, those people are not going to conform to a homeless shelter now, because their life mission, they've suffered a lot. They've been out here, they've got rained on, they've been mistreated, they've been disrespected. Now they're out here on the streets. These individuals become resilient in their philosophies, their ideologies, and their conspiracy theories. Tell me now that somebody who fought for the government ended up on the streets homeless, you're just going to grab them now like a little puppy and put them in a homeless shelter? No, dude, these individuals are hurt, and they have disdain for society. These individuals are not going to conform to homeless shelters. They feel hurt by society with reason. They've been done wrong. A lot of these people come from military backgrounds that they feel abandoned by their countries. People from the foster care system, they've never been shown love since childhood. These individuals have a lot of pain, a lot of trauma, and they're not just going to conform to society. They feel that in their state of homelessness, that perhaps by them inflicting pain on themselves and suffering on themselves, that they are more resilient to the threat that comes from the outside world, the lack of acceptance, their difficulties to integrate into society. So there are some definitely challenging issues that plague the homeless population. Many of them, those dealing with addiction, will benefit from a strict just enforcement of getting into a program and getting their lives together. Other individuals, their situations are far, far more different, far more challenging. How much do you think the government is really going to do for people that unfortunately are worth nothing to society? If people that are worth something to society don't get the best care, what makes you think they will? When you look at the size and scope of our education system, there's no doubt that the government has resources to help these people get the programs they need, get the assistance they need, may it be medical, psychiatric, whatever these people need. There's no doubt that there's enough resources to help them. But then you have individuals that by their own choice are going to want to live in these conditions because of their own personal trauma, their own personal ideologies. And these individuals are going to become reclusive. They're going to become difficult to find. They're going to become, well, even more evasive of society than what they already are. You know, all these homeless camp videos that we're seeing here is something that I exposed through discovery on our YouTube channel. None of us knew that this existed. I mean, we might have seen a garbage pile somewhere and figured somebody's living in a tent. But most of us in society did not understand that this existed on just a massive scale. You know, I just looked at the website from the government of Florida that talks about the new law, and it's saying things like, you know, we're not going to be like Florida or we're not going to be like California or New York. And I'm sitting here like, are you kidding me? The situation in Florida is, this doesn't exist in New York, not to this scale. So when you go even to the state of Florida and you read their explanation of the law, it's just covered with political ideology and misinformation. And that's where I worry that the intent isn't to fix the problem. The intent is to further a political ideology at the expense of the people. That's what they did with the immigration law, and that's possibly what they're going to do with the homeless law. And the interesting thing is that the vast majority of people actually tell me that they vote Republican. But again, they're still undesirable. And it just blows my mind how somebody could be in favor of the people that are oppressing them. But that's the way politics work. People are just blinded by politics. And unfortunately, when I look at this law, like when I look at the description of the law, like usually I do a very thorough investigation of the law before I make a video about it. But when I go to the state of Florida's website, it's all political rhetoric. Like if you go into the website and read about this law, it doesn't explain what the law is going to do. It explains a political rhetoric. We're not going to be like New York and California. Are you kidding me? Have you not seen the situation in the state of Florida? They are continuing to decline, to dismiss, not accept the reality of the proportion of Florida's homeless problem, the size of the problem. This is the problem. See, even when you go to the website that talks about the law, they are still denying the size and scope of Florida's homeless problem. So if the law in itself is wrapped in all this political rhetoric that is mostly focused on dismissing the notion that homelessness is even a thing in Florida, if you don't acknowledge the scope of the problem, how are you going to provide the resources to fix it? It seems like, sadly, this law is nothing more than another 1718. It's a law that on Fox News gets a lot of clicks, but in reality didn't change anything for the state of Florida. I mean, the immigration law did nothing. Everything's back to normal. People keep coming here illegally. It was a momentary political distraction, not an actual solution. 1718 didn't fix the immigration problem in Florida. Florida's got the same exact problem it's always had. And this homeless law will probably fix absolutely nothing. Because again, the purpose and the intended aim of these laws isn't to help the homeless, right? It's actually to portray Florida as different from New York and California. But again, they're not even acknowledging the scope of Florida's problem, because acknowledging that Florida has a huge homeless problem, well, it kind of is a slap in their face to their political ideology, because in theory it shouldn't be happening. But in reality, the state of Florida has a higher drug overdose death rate than California and than New York, significantly higher. So if you have more people dying from drug overdoses, it wouldn't be a surprise you have more people that are homeless from the same exact problem. If you have a state that doesn't have a state income tax, New York and California have it, they can fund their mental health possibly the reason why their overdose death rates are lower, by the way, is because they're actually funding healthcare. They're actually providing services. But the state of Florida doesn't have funding for that. So we're starting to see how it's steeped in political ideologies, and that may give us an indication of whether this law is actually going to make changes or it's just another news story for people to follow and for more people to move to Florida thinking that things are going to get better, but unaware of the reality of what's really happening in Florida that will probably continue to happen. Keep in mind, I lived in Cuba under communism, so I'm very keen at discovering inconsistencies with propaganda. When I see something that doesn't check out, I recognize it immediately. And when I go to read what this homeless law is going to do for the state of Florida, and the only thing I find is things like, we're not going to be like New York and California, it's steeped in political ideology. It's not really steeped in actual solutions. It's not like these people grabbed a bunch of, let's say, consultants, and they studied the problem, people like myself, for example, that are actually familiar with the topic, and said, okay, how can we actually make things better? No. They're saying, hey, homeless shelter or prison. Well, neither one of those things are a solution to homelessness because, those things have coexisted with homelessness for a very long time. You have people that are in prison right now. When they get out of prison, they're going to hit the streets. They got nowhere to go. It's a never-ending cycle. And to think that one single law is going to solve this problem, you'd have to be stupid to believe it. Now, for 10 or 15,000 of these people that are homeless in Florida, even if it's only 100 of them, if 100 people, a small percentage, if just 100 people walk off the streets and into a rehabilitation program and get some help, it's better than nothing, which is what we have right now in Florida. So even if only a small percentage of people that are actually homeless actually are given some services, actually are given the opportunity to get off the streets, even if it's a small percentage of people, it makes a difference. Every person that you're able to save out there makes a difference. But realistically, you got 100,000 people that are pooping outside in Florida. It causes a huge environmental concern. Do you know what 100,000 people defecating in public every single day does to our state, to our waterways, to our aquifers? I mean, it's unreal how much, and it's not like they're burying it. It's not like, they're just throwing it in the creeks. This is an ecological disaster beyond comparison. These areas, even if you go in there, skid steers and clear off the garbage, there's still needles and chemicals. I mean, this is like contamination for ages. And it's all happening in the state of Florida. It's causing a huge ecological destruction upon the state of Florida. This homeless problem is bigger than we imagine, but when the agencies are trying to minimize its effect because of how it may make them look bad. Oh, it makes us look bad, so let's pretend it doesn't exist. So here they are trying to cover themselves as politicians, trying to make it seem like Florida doesn't have a homeless problem because of their political agendas. What they need to be worried about is actually fixing the problem, actually taking care of the environment. But again, they're not concerned with finding a solution to homelessness. They are concerned with continuing to cover up the problem, because if the problem exists, it makes them look bad politically. So you have individuals whose intentions, again, are not to resolve the problem. Their intentions are to conceal the problem because it makes them look bad. What the state of Florida is doing by trying to covertly distort the figures of homelessness is no different than a drug addict person who's in denial about the problem. Okay, just like the homeless people are in denial about their addiction, well, the state of Florida is in denial about their homeless problem. They don't want to accept it exists. They don't want to acknowledge it. They try to minimize the problem. And as long as that is the ideology that the state of Florida has about this problem, how is it ever going to get resolved? You have to acknowledge the problem to fix it. You have to understand the problem in depth to be able to fix it. But of course, when the only thing people see is through their lens of political ideologies, how are they ever going to tackle the problem? Homelessness exists in every single state. A lot of people want to say it's a blue state problem, it's a red state problem. Homelessness exists in every single state. There's 50 states with 50 different sets of laws. Not a single state has been able to deal with homelessness. In states like Mississippi and Alabama that have low percentages of homeless population, A house in those states costs $5,000. So, I mean, the people that are housed in those states, their living standard is slightly above a homeless person. In fact, they're living in communities that are even more dangerous than, well, the communities where the homeless people are living in Florida. So at the end of the day, I've said it before on my channel, I'd rather be homeless in Florida than housed in Mississippi. So at the end of the day, it's not like the living standards in those states is worth living there at all. You know, right now, the states that have declining populations, Alabama, Mississippi, West Virginia, you have all these states that have declining populations. The federal government's trying to put people from other countries in those voids, but in reality, it should be these homeless people that need to be put in those voids. But here you have homeless people that are addicted in a place like Florida. If you put them in a place like West Virginia, then they're definitely going to spiral out of control. Anyways, no solution. There's 50 states with different laws. Some are liberal, some are conservative. Not a single state so far has been able to resolve this problem. So what makes you think that the state of Florida is going to resolve this problem when they're not even acknowledging the problem? They're pretending it doesn't exist. They're in denial. Just like a homeless person can be in denial about their addiction, the state of Florida is in denial about the situation. The state of Florida doesn't want you to see the footage that I'm showing you. I've put my life in danger by bringing you guys all this footage of all these homeless camps. They don't want you to know that this exists, right? So I'm showing you what they don't want you to even know exists. But the truth is the truth, right? Just like the homeless people are in denial about their addiction, the state of Florida is in denial about their homeless problem. And if you don't acknowledge the problem, you're not going to have a resolution to it. The state of Florida is not acknowledging the problem. Even when you look at the rhetoric, if you look at the law, you start to read the law itself, even the law itself is clouded in misinformation. It's clouded in political ideologies. That's not going to provide a solution. A better solution would require acknowledging the scope of the problem. And if the state of Florida were to acknowledge the scope of the problem, it would be on par with New York and California. It would far surpass it. I mean, even from FloridaHealth.com, the overdose analytics for Florida are significantly higher than California. So if your state has a significantly higher percentage of population that are dying from addiction, what makes you think you don't have a similar homeless problem? You may not see Florida's homeless problem because it's hidden in the woods, but it's there. And I'm talking small communities like Venice, small communities like Naples, places where you drive by and you don't see a single piece of garbage on the road. Walk back into those woods and discover another freaking world that exists, hidden, a parallel universe in plain sight, but that's hidden. It exists. It exists, and if you don't acknowledge it, then you're never going to be able to fix it. Acknowledging that it exists is the first step the state of Florida has to do. But again, acknowledging the scope of Florida's homeless problem contradicts their political ideology. But like I said, 95% of Florida's homeless population is addicted, and Florida's overdose death rate is significantly higher than California. California is 26 per 100,000. Florida is 37 per 100,000. So if you have a significantly higher overdose death rate, you probably have a significantly higher homeless population. You may not visibly see it. It's well hidden. Some of these homeless camps are half a mile into the woods. Some of these people are living a mile into the woods. It could be that these new laws in Florida about homelessness could act as an even bigger force to push these people into hiding even more, making it even less obvious. So it could be that the intent of this law, after all, isn't even to fix the problem. It could just be to force people further into the woods, further away from society, and be even more concealed. And it's possible that the way they implement this law and the way they start to actually enforce this law could actually serve not to fix the problem or to address it, but to just force these people deeper into the woods, force these people into hiding even further. And that in itself will cause the state of Florida to, again, continue to have this homeless problem. Again, I really question whether this law will be a solution to Florida's homeless problem. After seeing homelessness throughout the state of Florida, could it knock it off by 50%? Sure. Could it reduce homelessness significantly? Sure. Will a lot of people end up in services they desperately need? Absolutely. Will it completely fix Florida's homeless problem? It is questionable. It could be that these new laws are just intended to further marginalize the homeless population, to force Florida's homeless population deeper into the woods, make them have to hide even better, because it seems like the real intention so far hasn't been to help the homeless population. It hasn't been to rehabilitate these people. It seems like the intention so far has been nothing more than to marginalize, hide, and conceal the problem. And if that's the intention, what do you think the application of these laws will be?